Welcome to Time for Diplomacy. This podcast series is organized by the Diplomatic Academy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Montenegro. It is an opportunity to host distinguished theorists and practitioners of international relations in order to get their perspectives on contemporary diplomacy. Hope you will enjoy this episode.
Dear listeners, welcome to the new episode of podcast series Time for Diplomacy, which is organized within the Summer School for Young Diplomats Gavra Vukovic, a flagship project of the Montenegrin Foreign Ministry. The project lays a particular emphasis on the role and significance of diplomacy in maintaining international peace and security, overcoming crises, and developing new models of economic, political, and security cooperation in the international arena. We're pleased that some of the 14 summer school speakers will join us to this podcast series and share their thoughts on contemporary diplomacy and international relations. During today's 20 minutes episode, we'll have the pleasure to discuss one of the most important global issues, climate change. And our guest today is Professor Adil Najam, the inaugural Dean of the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University, who will share his perspective on this globally important topic. In past, Professor Najam served as the Vice Chancellor of the Lahore University of Management Studies in Pakistan, as Professor of Negotiation and Diplomacy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at the Tufts University, and he was Director of the Boston University Center for the Study of the Long-Range Future. Professor Najam also taught at MIT and at the Harvard Program on Negotiation. He's author of over 100 scholarly papers and author or editor of over a dozen books. Professor Najam was also a lead author of the third and fourth assessment of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, work for which the IPCC was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. His areas of specialization include global climate change and sustainable development, human development and human security, and international environmental negotiations. Professor Najam, welcome to Time for Diplomacy.
Thank you for that kind introduction.
You're an active advocate of the thesis that we're living the age of adaptation. What does this concept actually mean?
What it means, this age of adaptation, the idea that we are now already in the age of adaptation, what it means at its core is that climate change is no longer a future issue only. We have talked about climate change mostly as a serious challenge for the future, which is why, when people like me used to talk, we would always give you graphs of what might happen in 50 years or 100 years. Well, because of our failure to mitigate in time, we are now today already in a world where we are seeing climate-related changes. And what that means is that for a lot of people in the world, by my estimation, around 2 billion, maybe more people in the world, climate change is now a current, immediate issue that needs to be dealt with right now. Now, that does not mean that mitigation, which is the efforts in climate policy to reduce carbon footprint, is less important. In fact, it is in fact more important, because the less we mitigate, the more we will have to adapt. But what it does mean, what living in the age of adaptation means, is that we now also have to think about the policies, the actions, the activities that are needed to adapt to climate changes that are already happening, and particularly happening for the poorest people in the world. What that means for diplomacy is climate diplomacy is no longer about managing carbon, which it has been for most of the time. Climate diplomacy now also has to be about managing the impacts of climate change, and that means climate diplomacy has to be much more focused on development, because impacts is what is about development or what impedes development. That makes the climate diplomacy challenge a much bigger, a much more difficult, but also a much more immediate challenge than it was, mostly because we didn't meet the earlier challenge in time.
In your opinion, how effective has been the international community's response to climate change so far? And what kind of lessons does the COVID-19 pandemic offer for the looming challenges of climate change, meaning multilateral cooperation, science, and finances? And what are the key weaknesses and strengths of the international agreements and climate action in general? Can you provide us with your personal thoughts on this?
If you think about the effectiveness of the international response to climate change, one way to look at it is that the world now takes climate change much, much, much more seriously than when, let's say, a quarter century ago, let's say at the Rio Earth Summit in '92 or after that. So in that sense, there is much more attention. Everyone pays attention to it. Young people in particular, governments, leaders, they all realize that climate is a challenge. They all realize that climate is an important challenge. They at least realize that it is a political challenge in that they have to talk about it. Having said that, the honest answer to your question, which is about how effective has the response been, it has not been effective in that the response effectiveness ought to be what has happened to the climate, right? Not just what we are saying about climate change, but what climate change is telling us. And what climate change is telling us is that we have not been effective in managing our own lifestyles in a way that we can slow or reverse the climatic change that we have now known about for many, many decades. And therefore, it is not that it's a mixed bag, but a lot of effort has been in enhancing the profile of the climate issue, in enhancing the recognition of the climate issue. But in terms of action, in terms of policy, climate diplomacy, I would say, international climate action has not been effective, because I think the only measure of effectiveness of any diplomacy is what is the change on the ground. And the change on the ground, as we talked about earlier, is that we are now having to deal with climate impacts. At the beginning of this diplomacy, I think at least idealists like myself thought the world is going to come together and we are going to lick this problem. We are going to, if not solve, reduce this problem. And we, I do not think, have been able to do that effectively. That doesn't mean that nothing has happened. I do not believe that. I have worked in this area my entire life, and many, many, many good people have, and they have done many good things. I'm not saying that nothing has happened. What I'm saying is that whatever has happened does not add up to the level of what the challenge was, and the level of what the challenge is, and the level of what we know the challenge has to be. Therefore, I think there is a mismatch between our aspiration in climate diplomacy and our actual performance in climate diplomacy. In some ways, I do think that climate diplomacy has become a goal in itself. We have now this annual ritual of one COP, Conference of the Parties, after the other. We've had more than 25 of them. What that means is we have a quarter century of negotiation about a climate policy. But do we have a coherent international global climate policy? Do we have coherent international global climate actions that add up? We do have actions, but do they add up to the level of the challenge? I do not think they do, because in some ways we have used the excuse of the science as if we will need more science before we need to act. We have had plenty of science, in at least more than enough science to warrant action, that we have not been taken. So we have in some ways used science as an excuse. In another way, we have used diplomacy as an excuse by saying, okay, we won't be able to finish in this meeting, so let's meet again in a year. Sometimes I wish that we would put an end date and say, climate negotiations are going to end by this date, so that we can really focus on action. We can continue with more better policy, but we need to really step up if we are going to lead to this emergency. If you allow me 1 minute on why this has happened. I'm not a critic. I'm a friend of climate diplomacy. What I'm saying is that while we have worked hard, we need to work much harder, because the problem is bigger. So why has this happened? I think in partly what we are seeing is the limits of diplomacy. right? Diplomacy is based on this idea that every country will come and every country will try to get what is best for it, for each country. And somehow, when every country has achieved what is best for it, the collective answer will be what is best for the world. In many areas, but particularly in a truly global issue like climate, that turns out not to be true. And where we end up is the lowest common denominator. What every country can agree to is much less than what is needed by the world as a whole. And therefore, until diplomacy finds a way of thinking of the collective good and not just the individual good, it is not going to work. And it has not worked. We have seen that again in COVID. So what are the lessons from COVID, and why is COVID important? COVID is important because for many of us, maybe for most of us, this was the first truly global crisis of our lifetime, major crisis, major global. And the lessons we've learned, I do not think are all positive, because we have other crises like climate looming on the horizon. What happened with COVID? COVID marked in many ways one of the first casualties was multilateralism. In came COVID and we closed our doors individually, collectively, as countries. And instead of the world coming together, what we saw was a breakdown of multilateralism. Yes, there were islands of good news, but for most part, we said, I'm going to just save myself first. And later, maybe I will think about it. And in some cases, later we did, but then we saw with vaccine diplomacy, or the lack of vaccine diplomacy, that we are not really fully capable of thinking globally, even about global issues. So I think COVID has some very frightening lessons about multilateralism and about diplomacy that will be needed in climate. But on the other hand, we have two other lessons. One is about science. COVID reminded us of how blessed we are to have the type of scientific capacity that we of this generation have. And we were able to produce vaccines. We have been able to do a lot of useful science in climate. But the hurdle to science again was diplomacy and the coming together of how are we going to share it? How are we going to apply it? How are we going to make it global? Money was the final thing. In some ways, we always hear about climate and other things that there isn't enough money. What COVID reminded us is when the crisis is real, the money shows up. It is amazing how quickly we could find $1 billion in the US, how quickly we were able to spend $1 billion, not $1 billion, $1 trillion. Right? So when people, countries, policymakers truly believe that a crisis is real, the money shows up. But what COVID also showed us is that if you wait for the crisis to happen, then you will need to spend far, far more money than you would have spent in precaution to keep the crisis from happening. I hope we learn that lesson for climate. If we spend the money now to avert the crisis, to stop the crisis, that expenditure will be far, far, far less than what we will have to do if we wait for the crisis to happen, which in many ways we have, which is why we are in the age of adaptation.
Thank you for providing an eye-opening perspective on these two truly global, as you have said, and truly world-altering crisis that we are facing today. My final question pertains to countering of climate change, which means dealing with climate and economic migration at every level. What kind of sustainable development is needed to effectively face this ever-evolving context?
I think sort of, we have from the beginning, and unfortunately, posed climate policy as a cost. Right? So unfortunately, the conversation from the beginning became, okay, climate is a good thing to do, but if we do it, it will have a cost, and that cost will have to be borne by someone, and that is why we shouldn't do it until the cost come down. I think we need to turn this on its head. In some ways we are doing it, but we need to do it much more and look at climate not simply as a cost, but as a benefit. Right? Instead of worrying only about what is the cost of positive climate action, if we think for a moment how much benefit, how much economic benefit does climate give us? And climate policy is about maintaining, enhancing that benefit. So think about your daily life, the food we eat, the places we live in, the natural beauty we enjoy, our ability to get resources from the world, our ability to use resources for betterment of life. That the benefit that the climate system gives to the human economic system is just immense. And what we are talking about here is to maintain that benefit. And what we're talking about here is to enhance that benefit. So in some ways, the first step I think here is to get out of this binary oppositeness, that climate is the opposite of economic development. It is not, particularly for developing countries, right? Particularly from developing countries. And again, I go back to my age of adaptation. The age of adaptation's cost will be economic. What happens when climate changes? What happens with climate changes is that your agriculture systems may fail, which means economic loss. What happens when climate changes? What happens when climate changes are the type of fires you saw in 3 continents, the extreme fires. What does that mean? Economic loss. What happens when climate changes? Climate changes and you get floods. What does that mean? Economic loss. What happens when climate changes? You get extreme drought. What does that mean? Extreme costs. So in many ways, instead of focusing on the cost of climate action, or focusing only on the cost of climate action, let us also now in the age of adaptation, keep a very close eye on the cost of economic inaction. Climate change is now a threat to economic prosperity. It is not a drain from economic growth, it is a threat to economic prosperity. And that, I think, is what sustainable development is about. The not interesting ways, I've worked on sustainable development all my life, particularly in developing countries. And many times, I think too many people look at it in a very narrow way, as a sustainable development is development while taking care of the environment. That is not what sustainable development is. It's much more than that. Yes, that is a part of it, but it is much more than that. Sustainable development is development that can meet the needs of current as well as future generations, while maintaining the natural systems, right? And what that means is balance. What that means is meeting those needs. What that means is development. Now, this is particularly true for the poorest people in the world. I fear that one of the things that we are already beginning to see, and we'll see more of, is the rich sort of pointing fingers at the poor for not taking care of the environment, of not being able to differentiate, which will be wrong, which will be tragic, which will be criminal in my view, because the environmental footprint of the poor is very often a footprint of necessity rather than a footprint of luxury. That there is a difference between me as a richer person exploiting the environment for my whims, than for those who have to live and bank on the environment. And that's the sustainable development question. And the sustainable development question, again, forces us to think globally, right? Because climate and sustainable development happens in a global context, it forces us to think globally, and that is where diplomacy comes back. That is why we go back to this idea that diplomacy that is based only on meeting my interests is not going to lead us to sustainable development, right? Because that immediately becomes competitive. Here, what we are talking about, just like in COVID, is the need for a diplomacy that puts the global common purpose at the center of as the goal of diplomacy, rather than the goal simply being meeting my own interests. Now, that is not easy. I understand that is not how we train diplomats. I understand that is not how diplomacy has happened historically, but it has happened that way whenever we've had a crisis that has been truly global, infrequent, but possible. And therefore, we need a diplomacy, an economic diplomacy, as well as a climate diplomacy that puts sustainable development at its heart, which means We want a diplomacy where the goal is maintaining the natural services of the globe while meeting the interests of the people, and I would say particularly of the most marginalized, the most vulnerable, and the most poor people in the world who are at the front of climate change. That is not a small challenge, but it comes back to my central point that in this age of adaptation, the role of diplomacy is even more than it was. The challenge of diplomacy is even more. It may be more difficult, but it is also more important to get our diplomacy right.
Professor Najam, many thanks for taking part in this podcast series, as well as for providing your profound insights on such an important topic.
Thank you.
This podcast series is part of the project supported by NATO Public Diplomacy Division, whom we are particularly thankful for having recognized the program of summer school as conducted to the Euro-Atlantic agenda for a more secure and prosperous world. We also owe special gratitude to our long-standing partners, UNDP Montenegro.
This podcast series is a part of Summer School for Young Diplomats Gavro Vukovic project, the global platform that brings together young diplomats from all over the world and provides opportunities for learning, sharing, and networking.